live service games. How would you keep League of Legends in a functional playable state? You'd have to re-architect the entire game. The game is what is called client-server. So in client-server models, there's a server and there's a client, and all of the math, all of the game, everything happens on the server. The client just displays it. And the reason we want to do it that way is so that you can't teleport around and do a billion damage. You don't trust the client. You trust the server. The client just displays what it's told, right? So if we wanted to re-architect this, we'd have to take all of that server logic, push it back out into the client, and somehow make that playable in a multiplayer-only video game. That doesn't make sense to me. So this isn't going to work for all games. Why is it calling out all games? And it's
so I can't remember the exact terminology that it's called. Is it post-meteor? Hold on. Meteor law. The whole thing about things ex post facto, and yeah, yes, it's all about laws not working retroactively. This should not be applying. I think that the intent, from what I read at least, to that document, was to make sure that, oh God, let's turn this off, was to make sure that companies who in the future might be doing this don't get a chance to do it. Because that would be incredibly difficult to undertake, to want to revert something that, let's say, the likes of Ubisoft have established. And I don't know how that would even work. But let's hear him out.
It's really easy to say like, oh, you know, that'll get worked out down the line. But we're dealing with government here. If we're going to be putting up these types of ideas specifically in front of government, we need to be calling out the right issues, especially if you don't have precedent set. Because now you're going to be setting precedent on something that doesn't make any sense with people that may not understand the nuance of our industry, all in the name of saving games. I can't agree with that. So let's go into why this is happening, right? So why did this start in the first place? What is the specific cases they've called out that are egregious? And they have one. It's The Crew. So action on The Crew. The video game The Crew, published by Ubisoft, was recently destroyed for all players and had a player base of at least 12 million people. Due to the game's size and France's strong consumer protection laws, this represents one of the best opportunities to hold a publisher accountable for this action. If we're successful in charges being pressed against Ubisoft, this can have a ripple effect on the video games industry to prevent publishers from destroying more games. First,
okay. It didn't have 12 million players. Like, 12 million players bought the game, sure. And I fully disagree. I had that myself in my library the day that it got removed and was made unplayable even some weeks before. Fucking insane. And a thing that I will never forgive Ubisoft for doing. Even though they had short warning for them doing this, they still allowed people to buy the game up until the day of the deletion. That is scummy as fuck. You do not do that. There's no excusing that kind of behavior. Like, the product's going to be discontinued, but you can buy it up until 11:59. No.
First off, I don't like the idea in this that it has a player base of 12 million people. That is not how long-running games work. There is a large number of people that buy the game, and that player base slowly dwindles off until nobody is playing it anymore. If there's any costs associated with keeping the game online, which this was an online video game, then eventually it costs more to keep it online than it does to keep running it, right? So the cost outweighs the amount of income for it. There are bad business practices that can occur in there. There are companies that will sell a online-only game as a single-player experience and kind of just put it into the TOS and hide it. But not all companies do that. When they do, we should be calling out that specific company, not all companies. So let's take a look at this and find out more about The Crew itself. And if we pull up their Wikipedia, we can see that The Crew was actually created in 2014, which, much to the hatred of all of us oldies on the internet, was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh. So this was an online-only racing video game developed by Ubisoft Ivory Tower and Ubisoft Reflections and published by Ubisoft. So all Ubisoft, right?
Hey,
with that in mind, it said it was a scaled-down recreation of the contiguous United States and included both role-playing and large-scale multiplayer elements. So,
pardon me, I do believe that The Crew was marketed as a single-player experience where you could go into online mode. Wasn't it the same, just like not the Division, Watch Dogs came out the same year, did more or less the same thing. Like Watch Dogs had that online element with like invasion hacking, right? I do remember the game being marketed as a single player experience. I could just be remembering wrong here, a bit of Mandela effect.
It had a massive multiplayer component to it. It is an online-only service-based game, and they shut it down 10 years later. On March 31st, 2024, Ubisoft shut down the game's servers, rendering the game unplayable, which is normal for live service games. The only thing that I can see in here that could be a problem is if they posed it as not an online-only experience. But everything that I found online shows that the game was always marketed as online-only. If you're going
to which I'm going to state, I know that I'm pausing a bit here, this thing could be played offline. That's one of the issues that I have with that. And I fully get it. I fully understand. Server infrastructure is going to dwindle. Thing got an update with the crew too. The player base was falling. Flatlining even. I get it, but still, it would be nice to be able to have that single player component and not feel as if, despite the game being 10 years old, that you no longer have something that you bought. I think it's a fair demand to have as a consumer.
Going to be buying an online-only game, that means it can only run when it's online. And if the servers need to shut down in the future, far in the future, it makes sense to me for the access to that game to be cut, if it's online only. If it's a single player experience that has online only functionality specifically just to shut down the game in the future, and the online only doesn't actually add any gameplay functionality, I'd agree with you. That's a shitty business practice, but that's really rare. And in the specific cases where it does happen, we should call out that, not just all games and not all live service games. Further, there's more context to this too. The Crew itself came out in 2014, but it actually had a sequel that came out in 2018, and then it had another sequel that came out in 2023. And if we go to the Crew's SteamDB, which again is not going to be all of the player base for this, it's only going to show the ones who were playing it through Steam. It was on multiple platforms. And we look at the max here, it did start out with a sizable amount of community, and then it degraded, and it had a major drop-off in 2018.
That's a great point that you brought there, revived in private servers. Exactly. That can be done. Let's not act like it can't. Literally, specifically, the document that Akers found and the petition here is asking literally states that it doesn't require the dev to give up anything that is proprietary. Like code that they do not want to share is fine not to share. Right? Because it can be a touchy subject, asking for devs to give infrastructure to have something moved over to a private server. But plenty of games have done that in the past. Warhammer Online is doing that, right? It's still a thriving community. God forbid, Wildstar, that game is still thriving. EverQuest, Ultima, those are running on private servers. So you can if you want to. Now, that is to say, of course, if the company isn't being adversarial with that. An example for the World of Warcraft players will know about this. Classic servers, private servers were not doing great. The whole cease and desist situation that Blizzard had with Nefarious and all of those private servers that were engaged there was not a good thing. So there can be legal issues about that. But then it comes to the dilemma of, can we require developers to give us an expiration date? That becomes difficult. Because I guess that most people would then say in response to the lack of being able to port things to a private server, then give us an expiration date, right? Let us know whenever you are going to cancel the game, but you can't know that. You do not know whether or not your game is going to be successful for 5, 10 years, or 1. Think about the dwindling numbers of Helldivers 2, one of the good examples of a live service game until it wasn't. Like, I do understand the frustration that devs can have about this, but also you need to keep in mind consumers who are likely to want to keep on making investment on a product that is good also want to have a level of security to know that they're getting their money's worth. It's not hard to understand.
Which is the same year that it launched a sequel. This is normal. When a sequel comes out, a lot of the player base, if the sequel doesn't suck, will move over to it. And then the servers effectively die. You can't run a live service game on this few players.
That is also fair.
Most of the time, especially not if there's anything else that goes into it. And if we go into that anything else, and we could see that there was license problems. So on December 14th, 2023, Ubisoft delisted the crew and its expansions from digital platforms, suspended sales of microtransactions, and announced that the game's servers would shut down on March 31st. So they gave them 3 months. Usually I would say, hey, 6 months is probably a better deal. But if they're going to do 3 months, they're going to do 3 months. The only thing that I'd be interested outside of that is if there was a contractual obligation to do more than 3 months and they didn't follow it, if it was in the terms of service or not. Citing upcoming server infrastructure and licensing constraints. What were those licensing constraints? Well, it turns out that all of the cars in the game were licensed from the car companies. And a 10-year running game likely means that they had license to them for 10 years. And that means that it would likely reopen for negotiation. Now, understand that's speculation, but I've seen this type of a deal many times in the industry while I've been working in it. So it's not unlikely. If you're going to have to renegotiate on a game that has so few players and is not turning a profit anymore, you're probably just going to forego the renegotiation. And if those servers are aging, you're not going to want to recreate that infrastructure. And there are some people...
Obligatory rock and stone.
Who'll say, well, just make it all single player. Well, I've explained that that doesn't make any sense in the first place. If you're making it all single player, you'd have to carve off all of that, and it's developer time and money. When you already have sequels out and the game has basically no players left anyway, it makes more sense to just move on. I don't find that to be a problem from the developer perspective, and I understand that people find that to be a problem from the player perspective. These are two different ideologies, and that's okay to have two different ideologies. I just won't agree with it because I understand the burden that puts if we raise that problem in the way that we are right now. If you try to tell me that every studio needs to run their live service game indefinitely or not want to run one at all, then no one's going to run them. And we're going to miss out on adventures like Final Fantasy XIV. And even though I don't play anymore, League of Legends or any other live service game, any of them. You're talking everything, like even phone games, as funny as that is. A lot of people don't realize that phone games require online-only activity. What about things like Pokemon Go? What about stuff like Monster Hunter Now? What about any of these?
Okay, if you didn't mention Monster Hunter, then I would have said, okay, the rest doesn't really matter. But yeah, I understand that there are fan bases for the rest of them, of course. Yeah, like, I get this. It makes sense. But that's the thing. That's the problem, though. Regardless of how he currently feels about this, currently there are nobody else willing to take up this conversation. That should at least get started. And we can be very mindful of the fact that lobbyists, even those who don't know what the fuck they talk about within video games, have a tendency of being able to twist and turn those discussion into something that can profit them. What was the guy? Louis Rossman, the repair guy. I remember some years ago he took up to in court about something about video game repairs for consoles, I think. Well, like some lobbyists were present and just said a bunch of hoopla that made zero sense and somehow managed to make it sound as if Louis, the guy who was advocating for customer rights, was trying to get profit for advocating for that.
Companies also offer repair services that are after the warranty period. Carrying on, video game publishers rely upon secure media environments of the game console to protect their safeguards against sophisticated theft or piracy. To help the piracy video game software.
The piracy video game software?
To help the piracy video game software.
Do you at least read this into the mirror the night before you show up and testify in front of the committee? Or do you just write this on the bus on the way to the legislative building the same way that I did my earth science homework in 8th grade?
Software and hardware have security features that are built into them, and they're known as technical protection measures or digital locks. These locks prevent the play of any unauthorized game. Put simply, if a video game console's firmware runs a verification check on a game and it is not a legitimate copy, the video game won't play the console.
that's the kind of dissonance that there can be with these discussions. And who are going to take up the discussion once it actually make it to Parliament or whatever? You are going to have to deal with a customers' right organization who can at times be non-profit. Are they going to have the funds to run up against a multi-million-dollar company whose lawyers are specifically there to gaslight people into not even taking us seriously? That can be an issue. And that's why I do understand the desire to have things made more precise, but the conversation needs to be started in the least.
Never get any of them. And that's why I think this needs to not be vague. It needs to be specific about the business practice it's trying to defeat, which is specifically companies that are doing this under the guise of it being a single-player game, but adding online-only functionality that is not necessary and doesn't add any gameplay elements. That's the problem. So now we're going to go to Ross, otherwise known as Accursed Farms, the creator of this initiative, and one of the ones that's pushing it the most online. I'm going to let him say exactly why he thinks that this will go through very easily and why it is important, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't agree with it.
Comes law in the EU? Yeah, it might be. Now, it's not a guarantee, but I think if we get the signatures, this passes. Why do I say that? Well, it's a few factors.
Okay.
Politicians like easy wins, and this doesn't require them to do much at all. And unless it involves gambling or protecting children, politicians generally don't care about video games.
Yeah, I'm thinking immediately about the Hawaiian representative who was against EA's gambling problems.
This game is a Star Wars-themed online casino designed to lure kids into spending money. It's a trap.
So this isn't of big consequence to them or most of their constituencies.
I'm going to stop it there for a moment. The assertion that politicians just like easy wins, so this legislation will go through, or that politicians don't care about a multi-billion-dollar global industry and that it doesn't matter to their constituencies is incredibly absurd to me. I don't think this is the right direction at all for a movement like this. I think it's incredibly damaging and it makes our entire industry look bad, both on the player side and the developer side. If we're going to be putting forward anything that may eventually turn into legislation, it should be passing because it's the right thing to do for consumers and developers and that there's some kind of a middle ground, not just because it's an easy win and politicians don't care. This sets us off on a completely wrong foot.
EU law is already unclear on a lot of this practice anyway.
And that's dangerous. If we're going to be setting precedent, which could change the way that law works all the way down the road, then we need to be sending the right message, which this is sending a vague message that doesn't cover the actual problem. So this is not a win to me. This is a huge risk.
And we would be making it easy for them to settle it. It falls in line with other consumer practices. You know, how when you buy something, you're generally allowed to keep it?
Oh no. I guess this is where the dissonance comes, right? Because from what Thor has been saying so far, he's still focusing on the architecture part of the live services as a service and not a product. That's what we want to change.
In the case of live service games, in the terms of service for those, you are not buying the game. You're buying a license to the game. And that's the part that's really different here. If we don't like the idea of live service games as a whole, I get it. Don't play live service games then. Don't agree to those terms. But if we're under this weird idea that we need to get rid of all live service games or damage that practice in any way to keep in line with consumer policies, it is in line with consumer policies. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be there in the first place.
But this is hard to agree on. Like, literally, the freaking deadlock that I'm having right now. Most of Valve's games, they are live services, right? Team Fortress 2, live service. Turned into one, and people could run them on private servers. You get what I'm saying here? It's like, I want to agree with him, but it's like, no.
So this doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. You're not buying the game, you're buying a license to the game. In the niche cases where a studio is trying to sell a game as if you are buying it or purchasing it or using that language specifically and they give you a live service game instead, I agree that should change. That language should change. You are not purchasing the game, you are not buying the game, you are paying to have a license to a live service experience. I get that. Is that what this is doing though? The initiative is not trying to call that out specifically. It's trying to say that all games need to stay in a functionable, playable state, which is not calling out the language that is being used to manipulate the player. Call that out specifically, not this vague bullshit.
And finally, this is a diversion from really serious topics that politicians would prefer not to deal with.
That's really gross to me as well. The idea that this is just a diversion from serious topics and they can get an easy win in and we can just push it through and there won't be a lot of pushback on it and they're not going to have to think about it too hard. That's crazy dangerous, dude. If you're going to be setting precedent, if you're going to be putting forward something that you want to start a conversation to eventually become legislation, and these are the reasons for it, not only can I not agree with the initiative, but I can't agree with you. And I think that the tactics that you're using here are really disgusting. So yeah.
I agree with him. Like, I guess the reason why this video was disliked comes from the way that he expressed it. It is an unfortunate state of things where people are very angry about this whole thing, and people would like, to a certain degree, see live service burn completely, at least in its current state. And that despite the fact that there are good examples of those out there. As was pointed out before, Deep Rock Galactic is thriving, Warframe is thriving, Path of Exile is thriving. People are not complaining about those live services game because they are doing it well. Yet, when this thing kind of happens, when you're calling the person who actually wants to start a conversation's ideas about it gross, disgusting, people are not going to take it well. As somebody who gets to voice his meaning on the internet from time to time, I get where this is coming from. But I do get it. It's not a great thing to just go with a supposed easy solution, because they can do a switcheroo, flipping on us, not take it seriously. That's one of the worst things that can ever happen within gaming discourse. When we, as customers, as gamers, are not taken seriously. And that sucks.
Yes, I won't agree with that. And I won't agree with Ross. There's no way around that. I think this is gross. To sum it all up, no, I will not be supporting the initiative Stop Killing Games. You're not going to change my mind on it because I find this language to be incredibly vague and damaging to the rest of our industry. I think that it will be bad for both developers and players down the line in the way that it is currently written. And I think that starting a conversation that doesn't get to the core of the issue is both wasted time and leads to potentially bad outcomes. So if we want to talk about this, let's talk about the actual bad business practices. In the case that a studio is making a live service game and they sell it to you as a product, they say that you are purchasing the game or you are buying the game, when in reality you're actually purchasing or buying a license to that game. I think that we should be fighting about that. That needs to go away. A player should be well informed at the point of purchase that they are purchasing a license, not buying a game. And the reason that we have those licenses in the case of client-server interactions, like we had before, we're talking about client-server games, is so that they can ban you when you cheat at them. They revoke your license. That's why they revoke your license, to protect the gameplay of every other player that you're impacting when you cheat at these games. That needs to exist, but it needs to be better informed to the player at time of purchase.
Yeah, I actually have that on the list right now for the next video. It's going to be.
So I agree on that. This doesn't bring that up, though. It just attacks all video games that have online-only components and says that they need to keep being able to be played indefinitely. That doesn't make any sense to me. Aside from that, a lot of people really like live service games as they exist now. So trying to kill off all live service games, as some people have said online, doesn't make any sense either. Live service games are a great way to get away from the real world. They are about social interaction between players. Some people get married in them. Some people met their spouse in them and then got married in them. It's a really cool thing for a point in time in which you're having that social experience. And to destroy that just because you don't like them is very weird. I don't think that makes a lot of sense to me. I also don't think it makes sense the way that Ross is posing this as why it's going to pass. I think that's incredibly inflammatory and could lead to a lot of damage to both what he's trying to stop and to games as a whole. To say that the government just doesn't care and this is an easy win and we're going to get it through is disingenuous. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar global industry. To think that the government isn't going to be meticulously looking through this and looking for flaws and holes is absurd. So I don't think that's honest at all, and I find it disgusting. So for everyone who's mad about that, fine. Be angry about it. I'm not going to change my stance on that because I can't agree with this, both as a dev and a player. I see the danger involved, I see the vagueness in the language, and it doesn't make sense to me. If we want to fight for better conditions for players, then fight the actual problem.
And people do the unthinkable RP in them. Yeah. I like how there's always like those who are coming with a double kind of moral in these discussions, like literally wasting hours upon hours playing gacha games and being like, no, live service needs to die. The Night Train. Okay, quickly checking out the second part, and then I'll be doing some light gaming.
Hi, my name is Jason Thorhall, also known as Pirate Suffer, and the other day I put out a video called Stop Killing Games, saying why I would not support the initiative. Overall, it was actually quite positive. The analytics on it show that people really think it's a good idea. There's a huge amount of like ratio, and I received hundreds of comments from developers thanking me for putting it out because they can't speak publicly while they're at a business or a job elsewhere. A lot of the times, major companies will fire you if you are speaking out of turn and cause a PR disaster for those companies. And since this is such a popular thing among players, most devs aren't going to say anything to you. So I am. So let's discuss the most common requirement of the initiative.
And that's the thing. He spoke mostly on the part of the developer, and I think it's fine. It's also fine to disagree with him because I don't understand that. It feels a little bit inconsiderate on his side of things, but he is voicing some points that make sense from the point of view of a developer. Yet still, something like that is going to kickstart something more. Like, in order for laws like this to come into motion, you have teams, multi-country teams that need to sit together and have these conversations. So it's not... I understand the vagueness of it all, but I think that it is something that can be worked on in the process. And again, they still have until the end of, till July of next year, right? When I signed it, it was 20,000 votes. And yeah, we need 1 million, so I think we might be able to get there, but then again, it's just the EU.
Which is, games have to be left in a functional, playable state. Now, what happens if that game is a online-only live service game? Well, if you want that to stay in a functional, playable state, that means the devs have to release either server binaries or somehow carve off the game to be a single-player experience now. Some way to keep it functional and playable, right? Now, many of you are requesting, yes, I should get the server binaries so that I can go and make private servers for this. But that doesn't make a lot of sense in the real world. And the reason why is because it leaves developers open to abuse. So let's explore that a little bit. Let's say that you made your own video game, and you made a live service game. Maybe it's an MMO, maybe it's something else, right? And let's say that I want to monetize that game, but you don't allow monetization of the game by any other party. This makes sense because most creators don't allow for that. You can't just take someone else's art and profit off of it. Normal, right? So then I go, well, how am I going to force you to do this? Under this initiative, you would have to release the server binaries or keep the game in a functional, playable state at end of life. So I hit you with a ton of bots. I hit you with a ton of exploits. I attack your community. I destroy your Reddit.
Okay, so like Team Fortress 2.
Go after your business. I go everywhere that I possibly can to make this cost as much as it possibly can for you. And it's not hard to do this. We saw the exact same thing happen in TF2 recently. The massive amount of bots that were attacking the game. This is not infeasible. This is something that is very easily attainable today. And let's say that this goes on long enough that your game dies because you can't afford it anymore, and your studio has to shut down. At end of life, you now have to release those server binaries to keep the game in a functional, playable state. At which point I take those, I create a private server, and I monetize it. And some people have said, well, simply don't allow monetization of the server. Well, who's going to enforce that? If you want a government initiative to enforce that, that means the government has to build a registry of all of those games and all of that intellectual property that shouldn't be monetized, and then somehow enforce that with no one owning it because those studios have shut down. That's going to be a massive burden. On top of that, if you want to go the other route and say the company has to go and control it, well, what if the company's not around anymore? Is that just able to be monetized now? Again, this was obtained through abuse of the original creator. I don't think that's a good route. And this scenario gets even worse if you do allow monetization, because now I can just kill off your company and then monetize the server and no one will ever come after me. Now it's even more of a problem. So allowing monetization of this work is strictly worse. And for those of you out there that say, oh, this can be done right now, I could just destroy your studio and take your stuff anyway. You could, but this allows a route for it to be legal to do so. That's the problem. After putting this out publicly and talking to people about it, this specific scenario on both YouTube and Discord and Reddit and a bunch of other locations, I got a couple of takes back. We're going to start with the most extreme position and kind of go from there. So in the most extreme, people said live service games shouldn't exist at all, and the initiative will kill them off for good, and that's a good thing. Well, you don't get to define what players get to play or not play. You also shouldn't be able to get to define what developers build or don't build. You should not have creative control over the developers, and you should not have control over what is in my Steam library or on my phone. That doesn't make any goddamn sense. Aside from that, the initiative does not purport to kill live service games. It would just make it incredibly difficult to build said games and add a lot of risk to it.
Yes, okay, but I doubt that we are dealing in extremes here. We're not Siths, okay? At least I hope not. I really do hope that the people who are engaging in this are not thinking in absolutes, because that is not going to lead us anywhere.
Which is why I'm bringing all of this up and why I don't support the initiative in the first place. A lot of people don't realize that this will slowly diminish live service games in the market, because it's not an incentive for us to build them anymore, which means you get less multiplayer live experiences. That sucks. I like live service games. I enjoy playing things like Final Fantasy XIV. I enjoy going and playing in games in the past, at least, like League of Legends. These are games that are live service. They require a live service to run. And you shouldn't be able to take that away from people. And if that's your only position on this, not only are you disingenuous in what the initiative is purporting to try and achieve, but you're also aggressively attacking other players instead of trying to fix something. So the next one is that this is about games preservation, and that it needs to happen to preserve these types of games for future generations and for everyone to always have forever. But I would argue that this isn't actually preserving these games. Social games, such as, let's say, Apex Legends, require a number of players to be in the match at the same time so that you can have an experience that is only able to be obtained through lots of players interacting.
Okay. No, mate. No.
It's a multiplayer game. You need a bunch of people. How many of you have felt negatively when an MMO dies, or when a live service game dies? Oh, dead game. There's only 5 people online. Why would I play that? So why would you want to preserve a game in that state? That doesn't make any sense to me. You want to take down these live service games, put them up on a private server, and then play it with a couple of people. You're not...
No. That's a terrible take, mate. Literally, I brought the example with WoW before. We brought back Classic. It's not a few people. It's literally reverting a game to a state that is what most players, a lot of players, let's not say most, okay? What a lot of players wanted. If they can have that opportunity, let them have it. New Tokyo in 2024, yeah.
Bringing it back at its height, you're not taking a snapshot of what the game actually is. You're making it limp on in a way that doesn't make any sense. That's not preservation. And for those that may stop there and go, but private servers going to have a lot of players. Look at all the ones for World of Warcraft. Again, we talked about that. It opens up a route for abuse of the developers. So that is not a solution. And the last take that I got from this is, and it's the most reasonable to me, this is an initiative. It's not a law. Why are you upset? Just wait. I'm not going to wait. And the reason I'm not going to wait is because I see the start of this conversation not making sense. It's not including the actual developer side of the conversation. It's not showing the trials and problems that this could arise inside of the gaming industry for people who are actually making the games you play. I don't have any reason to be quiet about that. And many other developers aren't going to be able to speak on this. As I explained before, it's really easy to lose your job if you're working at a major studio and try to speak out of turn on something like this, especially with something people are so passionate about. Doesn't make any sense to stay quiet. And it also doesn't make any sense to wait until it's in a different form when I see that it has so many problems with the language as it is currently written. I should be able to be talking about this. In fact, I should be talking about this. I am a content creator specifically that is a game developer that has worked in this industry for 20 years. This is my wheelhouse. This is what I do. So for those who are calling for me to just be silent and sit in the corner, no. With all of that being said, I do think there's a consumer protection thing that we can fix here. It's just not really what the initiative is about. I think that if you're going to buy a live service game, you shouldn't be told you're buying the game. You shouldn't be told that you're purchasing the game. You should be told explicitly that you are purchasing a license to that game. The reason why is because that license needs to be revoked any time that you are cheating at the game and damaging the play experience of other players. While this is written in the TOS and the EULA, it's usually not clearly defined at point of sale. Or they throw a giant TOS in front of you and it doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, TOS doesn't do shit. User, the EULA, tend to have more to say there. But, okay. I hope that he had a conversation with Ross, at least. Or that they would have had an opportunity to have a discussion together about this thing. But, oh, God. Jeez. It's not dumb. It's not dumb. I agree here. Like, I get where it makes sense, but the issue with this is that, well, then have that conversation. Come with a proposition. But then again, it's difficult. Like he said in the start of the video there are quite literally some people who can even voice that without fearing of getting fired. And that sucks. And that's why I said in the beginning that there needs to be that consideration on the side of the dev as well. It's not going to be easy, but it needs to be a part of it.
I think as people skip past it. If at point of sale it says specifically, there's specific language stating that you are either leasing or purchasing a license or anything along those lines, that you're not actually buying the game directly, I think it would go a long way to informing consumers of what they're doing and protect them from some of these business practices that they didn't realize they were engaging in. That makes a lot more sense to me than force all developers to leave the game in a functional, playable state. And that's about it. That's all I really wanted to talk about with this. I hope that's clarified some things for some of you and some of the dangers that this can cause as it is currently written. If you're still mad about this, not much I can do about it. Outside of that, I'm going to be gone for the next 4 days, so if you expect me to respond or anything like that and you think I'm ducking the issue or hiding in some way, I'm not. I'm just in Vegas because there's DEF CON going on, which is a hacking convention, and it's the first vacation I've had in 5 years. I can't wait to see my friends out there. So with that in mind, see y'all later.
Well, that was it. Well, hopefully this pan out well. Kind of spicy there.